have a client who is narrow ISA, and he only has like primary compensations, which is like his shoulder IR on both sides is pretty limited. His single leg raise, it's about 70 degrees on both. His hip flexion is about 90 degrees on both. But like I have a question, because whenever I put him in a 90-90 or a glute bridge or a hook lying, he will always feel his quads instead of his glutes and hamstrings. I cannot get him to untense, and it's not like a stretch. It's not like a stretch feel sensation in the quad. It's like contracting sensation at the quad. So so I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So we first have to ask, why is he doing that? So with something like 90-90, from a rotational standpoint, what are you asking him to do? Are you asking him to externally rotate or internally rotate?
Internally rotate.
Okay. So what he's doing is he's attempting to internally rotate, but not at the pelvis. So if I set up in 90-90 or the Lewitt, right? And ideally I tuck into this position, that's going to get me some IR because of the 90 degrees of hip flexion. Well, another way I could get IR is I could attempt to extend the knees. So if I push into the wall, what does that do?
Yeah, like knee extension. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that would be the femoral IR?
It would, because when you extend the knee, the tibia has to externally rotate, and subsequently the femur has to internally rotate. So you're asking him to IR, and he's doing it likely the only way he knows how. And that's very common. You'll see that too with someone anteriorly orienting the pelvis. So they'll do this so that the back will still stay arched, and then they'll push into the ground as hard as they can, or in this case the wall, because that's your ground. And then what inevitably happens is you have someone getting a lot of quad as opposed to pulling with the hamstrings in this case. So go ahead.
Yeah, with the hamstrings, it's not that hard for him to feel it, especially if I put a heel wedge underneath his heel so he can press down into something. Mm-hmm. It's not hard for him to feel the hamstrings, but wherever I want him to feel his glutes, it's just quad. So,
well, now the issue when you use knee flexion to get the tuck is there's a difference between utilizing distal hamstrings, which is what you're going to get with knee flexion, and proximal hamstrings glute. Because you can have selective recruitment of one aspect of the hamstrings versus another. And this is something that has been documented in the research, at least in animal studies from what I've read. You can have selective recruitment of one aspect of the hamstrings versus another. And in this case, what's going on is you have a situation where this person can't elicit the movement at the pelvis. And so what they're trying to do is use a more distal strategy, which could be digging the heels down and probably pushing to try to drive internal rotation at the pelvis. So what you'd want to do in this case is if they can't get it with something like a Lewitt or 90-90, you need to find an easier position for them to create the proximal positioning. So if we assume that this person has ER measures and they have the ability to get into hip flexion and utilize or perform the appropriate mechanics that we need at the pelvis, what I would probably do with them is try a position where I can emphasize or make the tuck easier. Because here's the issue with being supine. When you're doing the tuck, you have to perform it against gravity, which even though something like 90-90 or Lewitt is an easy move and a good starting point, trying to do this or do the lift pushing up against gravity, so that can be a lot harder. So what you want to do is find a position where you're not doing it against gravity. So your options could be a squat, because now I can use almost gravity to, or it's less of a gravitational action as I'm going down. I could do gravity assisted with something like quadruped, where I can elicit the tuck here, and that can still get you the mechanics. Or push comes to shove, you could do something inside lying and encourage the tilt that way. That way gravity has been eliminated as part of the equation. So if you have someone who's Quad City DJs and hammed like bacon distally, when you're doing something like 90-90 or Lewitt, it's probably too hard to get the tuck against gravity. So take them out of that, get an easier position, see if you can recruit it that way. And if you do that, chances are you're going to get a good improvement.